Todd Monken pulled the plug on practice today. Not because of lightning, not because of a scheduling issue, but because things got physical enough that he decided he'd seen all he needed to see. And that's not even the part of day 16 I want to start with. Because buried underneath all that chaos was one of the more encouraging performances Shedeur Sanders has put together all camp. Let's talk about the quarterback play first, because that's the reason most of you are here. Sanders was running with the second-team offense, and during a 7-on-7 period, he found Gage Larvadian on a wheel route down the sideline. I want you to understand how hard that throw actually is. You have to sell the vertical stem long enough to hold the corner's eyes, then drop the ball in over the shoulder before the sideline eats up the space you have left. There's no margin for error. Sanders threaded it clean. If you've been tracking him all camp, you already know this is becoming his signature rep. The one throw that shows up on tape and makes evaluators nod. That's an NFL arm making an NFL decision, not a camp-friendly completion against a soft look. He wasn't the only one having a good afternoon either. Cole Wilson flashed again, and so did another receiver working in that second unit, giving Sanders weapons to build around downfield. When your depth options are winning one-on-ones like that, it changes the math for a young quarterback. He doesn't have to force anything into a window that isn't there. He can trust the read and let his guys go get it. That relationship between quarterback and weapons doesn't get talked about enough when people evaluate camp performances in isolation. A young passer can have great footwork, great eyes, great anticipation, and still look average on tape if the guys running his routes can't separate or can't finish. Sanders isn't dealing with that problem right now. Every week it feels like a different name steps up around him, which means defensive coordinators can't key on one obvious outlet and shut the whole operation down. That's not a small thing heading into the regular season. That's the foundation of an offense that can actually function once the lights come on for real. Now here's the moment that's going to get clipped 100 times before September even arrives. A rookie receiver on the roster ran a block physical enough to put veteran linebacker Quincy Williams flat on the ground. Stop and think about who Quincy Williams is for a second. He's not a camp body you forget by September. He's a veteran who has made a career out of understanding leverage, angles, how to shed a block before it fully develops. For a rookie to run through him and drive him into the turf during a practice rep, that's the kind of thing that gets circled by a coaching staff, even when it never shows up in a box score. Camp legs are camp legs. Everyone knows that caveat. And I'm not going to pretend one rep in mid-August tells you everything about a rookie's ceiling. But physicality like that, at that exact stage of a young receiver's development, tells you something real about how he's wired. Effort like that doesn't get taught in a meeting room. Either you play with it or you don't. And this kid played with it in front of the entire coaching staff. That's the kind of rep that starts conversations in the building that fans never hear about directly. Position coaches notice. Special teams coordinators notice. Because a rookie who blocks like that in space is a rookie who's going to get a real look on kickoff and punt units regardless of where he sits on the receiver depth chart in September. It's a small moment inside a much bigger practice, but it's exactly the kind of small moment that ends up mattering when roster cutdowns roll around and coaches are deciding between two players who look similar on paper. On the other side of the quarterback room, Deshaun Watson was working with the ones, and he had a rep worth talking about too. During a blitz pickup period, he identified the look pre-snap, got out of the called play, moved into something better suited for the pressure, and connected with Isaiah Bond for a touchdown. On paper, that sentence reads simple. In practice, that's exactly the kind of processing teams build entire evaluation periods around. Can the quarterback see it coming and adjust before the ball is even snapped? Watson passed that test clean on this particular rep, but the day wasn't a clean sweep for him. On a separate snap, Denzel Ward ripped away a would-be completion between Watson and Bond. Ward has quietly been one of the steadiest players on this entire roster for years now, and that rep is a reminder why. He's the one corner who can take a completion away from either quarterback in this competition, first team or otherwise. If you're watching the defensive side of this camp as closely as the quarterback battle, Ward remains the standard everyone else is measured against. Now let's get into why practice actually ended the way it did, because this is the part of the day that's going to dominate the headlines. During a period the staff labels move the ball, things got chippy fast. A defensive lineman made real contact with Sanders' arm, not the incidental kind that happens in a crowded pocket, but enough to register as an actual physical moment. Then, on a run play shortly after, a defensive back knocked running back Quinshon Judkins to the ground. That was the breaking point. Monken cut the period short and shut practice down for the day. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Because the why matters as much as the what. According to reporting out of camp, Monken's frustration wasn't with his offense getting exposed. It was directed at his own defensive coordinator for dialing up overly aggressive blitzes during a period that's specifically designed to let the offense build rhythm, not survive live bullets. That distinction matters. This wasn't a head coach upset that his defense looked too good. This was a head coach upset that the structure of practice had been violated, that blitzes had crossed the line from competitive into careless during a session that was never supposed to be live fire. And Browns fans understand exactly why that stings right now. This roster cannot afford unnecessary injuries in the middle of August. Not with a quarterback competition still fully alive. Not with skill position battles still being sorted out on tape. Not with a defensive front that already has bodies cycling through the training room. When a head coach is reportedly frustrated with how physical his own coordinator let a non-live period get, that's a red flag worth watching over the next few days, because the cost today was real. Think about the incentive structure here for a second, because it explains why this kind of friction happens every single training camp across the league. A defensive coordinator is being evaluated on how his unit performs, how disruptive it looks, how many splash plays it produces on tape that gets cut up for the front office. An offensive-minded head coach is thinking about the bigger picture, about keeping his skill players healthy through 6 weeks of camp so they're actually available in September. Those two priorities are not always aligned, and when they collide during a period that's supposed to be collaborative rather than competitive, you get exactly what happened today. It's not a coincidence. It's a structural tension that exists on every roster in the league, and how a staff manages it says a lot about organizational discipline. Several players walked away from that session banged up. The injury list grew, and maybe the name that stings the most on it belongs to Mike Hall Jr., who was in his very first practice back after an extended absence. Think about the cruelty of that timing. A player finally clears whatever restriction had kept him sidelined, gets back on the field for the first time in who knows how long, and it's that exact practice, the one he chooses to return in, that ends up shut down for being too physical. You can't spin that positively. It's a signal that the staff needs to be more deliberate about how these periods are structured going forward. Especially with camp attrition already a real storyline on this roster. Let's talk about that second-team offensive line for a moment, because it changes how you should read Sanders' day. It's tempting to look at a backup front struggling in protection and assume it's a talent issue. I don't think that's the honest read here. The real issue with that group has been the injuries stacking up, not a shortage of ability among the guys filling in. When you're constantly rotating bodies because starters are banged up, continuity takes a hit no matter how talented the replacements are. Offensive line play is built on chemistry, on knowing exactly how the guy next to you is going to react to a stunt or a twist without having to think about it. You lose that the second you start swapping pieces week to week, and this group has been swapping pieces for a while now, which makes what Sanders did even more impressive, not less. Operating efficiently, hitting a difficult wheel route under those circumstances, tells you he's doing his job regardless of who's in front of him. There's a version of this story where a young quarterback behind a shaky line starts speeding up his internal clock, bailing the pocket early, missing checkdowns because he's thinking about pressure instead of reading coverage. That's not what I'm seeing from Sanders right now. He's staying patient in structure, letting plays develop, and still delivering the ball on time even when the protection in front of him isn't ideal. That's a trait, not a coincidence. And it's exactly the kind of thing that tends to translate once a player gets a real shot with a healthier group up front. Now the numbers. Because even an incomplete tracker from a practice that ended early still tells a story. Sanders finished 10 for 13, which comes out to just under 77%. That's an efficient day by any standard, second team or not. Watson threw 25 passes, connected on the Bond touchdown, and finished around 64%. Dylan Gabriel, in more limited work, went 8 of 8, completing 75% of his attempts. Line those numbers up side by side. And Sanders actually posted the highest completion rate of the three, even with the smallest sample. Does that mean he's outright outplaying Watson? No. And I'm not going to pretend a 13-attempt sample against a 25-attempt sample settles anything on its own. But it does tell you Sanders continues to be efficient with the reps he's given. And that's exactly the kind of week-over-week trend that builds a real case as camp goes on. Which brings me to the quote I think matters more than anything else that came out of today. General Manager Andrew Berry said, "Sanders continues to show real growth, specifically in processing speed, in deep ball touch, in accuracy, and in pocket navigation, compared to where he was as a rookie." That's not coming from a fan account or someone with an agenda. That's coming from the man ultimately responsible for building this roster, on record, saying his second-year quarterback is developing across multiple categories that actually matter. Processing speed and pocket navigation are two of the hardest things to teach any young quarterback. If Berry is seeing legitimate growth there, that's a substantive signal, not just coach speak dressed up for the cameras. I'll be straightforward about where I stand. I want Sanders to win this job. I haven't hidden that. But I also want to be fair about what winning it should actually look like. If Watson comes out over the next couple of weeks and plays genuinely well, I'll be satisfied with that outcome too. This was never about rooting against a player. It's about wanting the best version of this offense on the field in September, whoever ends up starting it. I think what makes this competition genuinely interesting, rather than manufactured drama for the sake of engagement, is that both quarterbacks are giving you real evidence to work with. Watson isn't struggling out there. He made a genuinely difficult pre-snap adjustment today and cashed it in for a touchdown, which is exactly the kind of veteran process you'd expect from a quarterback who's started playoff games. That matters. You don't just hand a job to the guy with the better camp completion percentage and ignore everything else a starter needs to do. Pocket presence under duress, command of the huddle, the ability to get an entire offense out of a bad play before the snap. Watson has shown flashes of all of that this camp too. This isn't a situation where one guy is clearly overmatched and the other is clearly ready. It's closer than a lot of outside narratives want to admit, and that's exactly why every practice report from here forward is going to get dissected this closely, which is exactly what makes what's coming next so important. All the camp data, the wheel routes, the checkdowns, the completion percentages, it's useful information, but it's still practice. The joint session against Buffalo on Thursday is where I think we start getting real answers. That's a different tier of competition entirely. It's not your own defense running scripted blitzes during a move-the-ball period against players who see you every single day. It's an unfamiliar roster, different disguises, different speed off the edge. How Sanders handles reps against a genuine outside opponent, reps that carry more weight than another script against familiar faces, is going to tell coaches and fans far more than another day of 7-on-7 ever could. So here's where Day 16 leaves this competition. Sanders keeps building a quiet, efficient case with the second unit, punctuated by a difficult throw to Larvadian and a completion rate that led every quarterback on the roster. Watson had his own strong moment, checking into the right play against pressure and hitting Bond for a score, but also had one stripped away by Denzel Ward, playing the exact brand of football he's built his reputation on. And the day ended not because of anything either quarterback did, but because the defense got too aggressive during a period that was never supposed to be live, costing the team practice time and adding more names to an injury list that was already growing. Monken's frustration with how that period was called is worth watching closely. If it happens again before Thursday, that stops being a one-off and starts being a real coaching problem. The kind that shows up in postseason reviews of how a training camp was managed. One heated period is a bad day. A pattern of it is a program-wide issue, and this staff knows that distinction better than anyone watching from the outside. There's also a broader lesson buried in today for anyone trying to project this roster forward into the season. Depth is going to be tested constantly over a 17-game schedule, and how a coaching staff protects that depth during a low-stakes August practice tells you something about how they'll handle it when the stakes are real in November. Injuries are going to happen no matter what anyone does. That's football. But there's a difference between the injuries that come from the game itself and the injuries that come from a scripted, non-live period getting away from its intended purpose. Today felt like the second category. And that's the part of this story that should stick with people longer than the highlight of a rookie flattening a linebacker. Keep your eyes on Buffalo. That joint practice is going to tell us more about this quarterback competition and about this roster's overall health heading into the preseason stretch than the last 2 weeks of intra-squad work combined. Different jerseys across the line of scrimmage change everything. They change the disguises a quarterback has to read, the speed he has to process at, and the pressure he has to feel from players who don't already know his tendencies from 3 straight weeks of practice against him. That's the environment that actually starts separating real development from comfortable, familiar reps. We'll know a lot more by the end of this week than we know right now, and I'll be back with the full breakdown the moment that practice wraps.